Hey everybody, I just got back from Walmart where I made an uncomfortable purchase. What am I talking about? Why would purchasing a cane be an uncomfortable purchase? Was it the cost? No, it cost about as much as, say, a mixed drink in a bar in a major city. Uh, it was just being in that aisle, next to the pharmacy in Walmart, walking up and down the aisle trying different canes. It just made me feel old. But I'm going to a expo in Dallas, Texas for Earth Day called EarthX, and we're going to have a booth. It is going to feature the Geb comic book and comic strip characters and nothing else. It's all about Geb. And I'll be there with other people on the Geb team, and we've got Geb jackets and Geb shirts, and we're just going to Geb it up. It's going to be awesome. So, hey, if you're in and around Dallas, come on by. Say hey. Apparently, our location is quite near the entrance, so I'm hoping we sell a lot of comic books and don't have to ship any home. But I'm going to talk briefly. I'm going to be playing Mothership today. This is a tabletop role-playing game that I don't play on a tabletop. I play over Roll20, which is a telemediated service for letting people play games as if they were in the same room together. And so that starts in less than half an hour. So I don't have a lot of time to edit or anything like that. So I'm going to be really quick and not go into great detail or hopefully say anything that is imprudent and will require me to edit it out. But I've been reading the book Doom, full title on screen here, by Niall Ferguson. And he wrote the book at least he wrote the parts about COVID, which I'm into now. I think he said in November of 2021, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, it's a book. Books take a long time to write, and they take an even longer time to publish, often cases. So it's a new book, but this is a perspective that is not new. I'm sure he was updating it right up until publication, but yeah, so these views are a little out of date. He has no patience whatsoever for any of the Red Tribe's conspiracy mongering. And he probably throws the baby out with the bathwater, going a little too far in that regard, but it might be worth it. But what do I mean going too far? Well, as I was at Walmart, actually, after I'd left, I put my groceries in the car. I'm getting ready to drive home. I'm listening to the part where he's talking about all the different right-wing conspiracies around COVID, and he basically puts the idea of it being the result of a lab leak on a par with, the conspiracy theory that every jab of the inoculation contains a microchip put there by Bill Gates to track your movements. Or another doctor, I don't know, who claimed that the vaccines had alien DNA in them. I would love for that to be the case. I mean, we would be living in a much more entertaining universe were that true. I think we live in a marvelous universe, but not quite that specifically designed to appeal to my, fantasy sense. But I think it's good that Ferguson doesn't have any patience for the right-wing nuttiness, and I think pays undue deference to the Blue Tribe, fixations around COVID. Because one of his larger points, and the interesting thing, this whole book's not about COVID. I mean, that's the selling point right now, because that's such a topical topic. But it's about doom. It is about the politics of catastrophe, which I think is actually the subtitle. And one of the major points that he makes in the book repeatedly, even before he comes to COVID, I mean, he talks about volcanic eruptions, famous from history, like Mount Tambora or Vesuvius, things like this. He's talking about earthquakes and tsunamis. He talks about war. And he's talking about epidemic disease, but not just COVID. Particularly he goes into a lot of detail talking about the 2018, not 2000, 1918, the Spanish flu that coincided with World War One. And he goes to great lengths to say, look, that was some serious fucking shit. And it is stupid and irresponsible to compare COVID to that. It is better to compare COVID to the Asian flu pandemic of 1957 that took place during the Eisenhower administration. Familiar with that one? I wasn't. It was no big deal. And Ferguson goes on at length talking about how in 1957, almost nobody had a job that could be done from home. So the idea that you were going to shut down the economy to prevent this thing from spreading was not even on the table, not even a plausible, notion that anybody could entertain. Everybody had to go to work. So there was no shutting down the economy. No. The death toll from the Asian flu pandemic of 57 was COVID's not over, so we don't know what the death toll is going to be. But he thinks that it wasn't quite as deadly, but it was the closest analog in modern history to COVID. And that the Spanish flu, order of magnitude worse. So much worse. Which I think is instructive. I think he's established some blue tribe credibility by basically, chopping the red tribe off at the knees at every opportunity and giving a free pass to all the blue tribe nuttiness. Because the largest point, the point that he comes to again and again and again, he also dwelt particularly on the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, and goes into depth in the into the post-mortem, into the post-accident investigation and inquiry to see what happened and who was at fault. And the media at the time instantly wanted to pin the blame on Ronald Reagan. He was a Republican, they're mostly liberal, and, they just wanted to blame Reagan. And something that Ferguson, it's a point he makes in relation to Challenger, it's a point he makes in relation to world wars and pandemics. Typically, the people who determine policy and the people who determine public scale responses to disasters are not the people at the top. It is middle management. It is, a accounting or managerial functionary somewhere who's not a boss of anything, really. He's in the middle of the hierarchy. But the people at the top of the hierarchy are not so knowledgeable about the planned pandemic responses that they're micromanaging things. They barely have a clue. Imagine, how much do you think Donald Trump really knew about the various preparedness plans for a coronavirus pandemic, which had been expected? Maybe not a coronavirus, but certainly an upper respiratory virus. It had clearly been anticipated in many a government report for decades. And yet, when it actually came along, Western countries like the United States, and the United States in particular, absolutely just shit the bed. Fucking useless in their response. And countries like South Korea and Taiwan, they were just, boom, on the ball. And what they did, which Ferguson praises, was all the contact tracing and the quick investigation and figuring out who any given patient had had contact with in the days prior to their developing symptoms and going and isolating those people. That was brilliant. Blue Tribers here for a time, they might deny it now, but there was a time, and Ferguson describes it in the book, were praising CCP, China, for welding people's doors closed and, imposing these just draconian and wide-sweeping, lockdowns of society. He said that was excessive. It certainly did more harm than the virus itself. To praise that is just short-sighted in the extreme. And it wasn't that heavy-handed approach that worked. It was a smart, surgical, technologically enabled, and number and data-driven approach that they took in South Korea and Taiwan that really, nipped it in the bud. And the reason that didn't happen here in the States had nothing to do with any politician. It was Apple and Google and Facebook and basically all the big tech companies are like, we're not going for that. Fuck that. So anyway, the idea that what he's coming around to And what he has to build up a lot of credibility, by flogging the red tribe for a blue tribe audience is it wasn't Donald Trump's fault. And to insist that it was is just pure ideologically driven malice. There is no basis in sane, reality grounded thinking that can lay the failure of the U.S. response to COVID at the feet of Donald Trump. Which I think is, it's a decent message. And don't get me wrong, I didn't vote for the guy, don't plan to vote for the guy, in spite of what you might read in any book. What am I talking about? Here's the book. There's a chapter in it about me, which is not factually accurate. But anyway, I wanted to read some words to you from Charles Eisenstein. Charles Eisenstein is somebody that I've interviewed many times over the years. I've interviewed him, by Skype. I've interviewed him at his house in Pennsylvania. He's somebody that I associated not so much with the peak oil crowd, but more the reality sandwich crowd. But both crowds, I was done with the reality sandwich crowd long before I, decided to push myself away from the peak oil table. But he kind of straddled both, but he was more the reality sandwich type. And I just had no interest in, what the psychedelic cult leaders had to say about COVID. And, I lumped Charles Eisenstein into that group, probably unfairly, because he sent out a newsletter pimping a new book that he's got coming out. And it's a book mostly composed of essays that he wrote during COVID about COVID. And a lot of what he said, I really, in this newsletter, I really resonated with. So one of the things in the newsletter that he wrote that I liked was, quote, "By the end of 2021, a lot of people were either hardened in their COVID opinions or numb to the issue entirely. I was a little bit of both. I don't know about numb to the issue, but certainly just sick of it and not interested in hearing anybody who had a really strongly held opinion on it and was really animated in the delivery of that opinion. I did not want to hear it. I didn't care what it was. I was not interested in any COVID-based mania. I wanted no part of it. That was my position. And while I didn't articulate it as well as Charles does in the passage that I'm about to read, this is basically the position I took. Quote, and we're starting in mid-sentence, so we start with an ellipse. "Much of the nuance and complexity of what I was saying was drowned out at the time by a storm of primal social and psychological forces, hysteria and counter-hysteria, mindless conformity and reflexive defiance, mob morality and mass psychosis, unprocessed death fears, and latent social resentments." Close quote. Hysteria and counter-hysteria. Beautifully put. I thought that the Blue Tribe legacy media, response and narrative around COVID was hyperbolic. I thought it was pushing, and this is something Ferguson talks about in the book, is that in our current society we have developed no tolerance whatsoever for any form of risk, regardless of the cost that we're called upon to mitigate the risk. There are some risks that are worth taking, particularly when you take into account how much diminishing that already small risk costs you, either financially or in terms of your liberty, or in terms of your ability just to live the life that you're accustomed to living and engaging with life in a satisfactory way. There's always going to be some risk, and there's always going to be some people. There are always going to be some people who have no tolerance for any risk whatsoever, particularly if they think that they are in a higher risk category than other people. And, he talks about the Asian flu pandemic of 1957, and part of the cultural attitude to that was it was just an accepted fact of life that one of the risks you faced in living was contracting a communicable disease, some of which were fatal, some of which were crippling. And that in 1957, people were, and I think rightly, a lot more scared of polio than they were of the Asian flu. And there was an election the next year, 58, and there was the death toll from the pandemic was not an issue in the campaign. Nobody blamed Eisenhower for it. Nobody thought to blame it. It didn't even compute to the more robust and reality-grounded people of 1957 that, you could blame your leaders for communicable disease. All right, my phone says the device is too hot, and it's because it's sitting on the dashboard, and while I'm in the shade, the phone is in the sun, so I must stop here. And I don't want to do any editing. I have to, to insert the clips, the text from the clips. But I'm going to stop talking. I will talk to you later. Be well.